Why did we do this story? Well, I think it's the greatest story that's never been told, or at least not told properly. And so much of what we do today can be traced back to that 40 or 50 years in history.
In 507 BC, the ancient Greek city of Athens experimented with a new form of politics. It was called democracy. One of the first foreign policy acts of the new democracy was to seek an accord with the greatest empire in the world, Persia. Then a few years later, Athens turned around and helped launch an attack on Persia. The mouse attacked the elephant. The new democracy started a war, a fight to the death, that lasted on and off for nearly 50 years.
Hi, my name's Dr. Michael Scott, and today we are going to go back 2,500 years to the war between Greece and Persia. The Greco-Persian Wars 2,500 years ago were a clash between two peoples, two cultures, two systems of government, two continents. The first clash between East and West, a clash that has, sadly, continued all the way to today.
There are people fighting and dying today for the same ideals that the Greeks were 2,500 years ago. Look at Egypt, Tunisia, Yemen, Syria. These people are still fighting for the same thing that the hoplites at Marathon defended.
It's a great story. It's an epic.
We ended up getting contributions from 10 experts and 4 researchers, which I think is the largest number for any documentary as far as I know.
Logic should tell us that the mere might of the empire should have won.
The Athenian democracy had to win the war to survive.
But they do defeat them.
That war would shape much of our world today, and is even argued to have contributed, eventually, to the self-destruction of democracy and ancient Greece. And 2,518 years after Athens experimented with the new political system called democracy, people are still struggling and dying for the perceived freedom that it may bring. But the embers of war have also flared up time and again between the West and parts of the Middle East since that first conflict, and much of the world is still unaware about how the war started.
In 50 years, we had a complete shift of power from absolute monarchy or despotism across to democracy.
That's the great thing about this story, is that even if you know nothing about this period of history, once the story gets rolling, it will hook you in and you will follow it right through to its end.
The story is still as relevant today as it ever was. It probably has more influence than even World War II.
It's amazing just how popular this period of history still is. It's the origins of our Western culture.
You could not have written a more interesting story for Hollywood. It had all the elements of a good drama.
Love, sex, adventure,
Courage, treachery, betrayal,
war, death.
Family issues with, sibling rivalry and
incest even.
I think as well the story itself is as relevant today as it was then.
There are so many twists and turns in this story, you really couldn't have made up a story like that. It would have to be true.
Well, I think it's the greatest story that's never been told.
Where do you start in the making of such a big story? We've all heard of Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, but they were only 3 days of fighting in a conflict that lasted on and off for nearly 50 years. So there must have been other heroes.
I'd never heard of Cymone until I started doing this research. But now I realise that Cymone was as important, if not more important, than any of the other heroes.
No story from the ancient world would be complete without a romantic element.
Caimon really did genuinely love her and was very loyal to her. He was just obsessed by pursuing his dream.
He doesn't start out a hero. He starts out just like any young guy, really. He drinks too much, he womanizes. He pretty much just doesn't want to grow up. He holds it off, but his first battle at Marathon just really thrusts him into maturity.
Caimon's father was stabbed in the back essentially by his political enemies, and the consequence of that was that Caimon then became bankrupt and destitute.
Are you with me?
And he becomes a unifying link in Greece, really. People forget that his great victory at Eurymedon, it was equal to the battles of Salamis and Marathon put together in one day. It pretty much broke the Persians forever. In a time where arranged marriages were the norm and the bride and groom didn't know each other, here's Caimon. He spent several years trying to win this girl over, and in the end he did. It was almost like a fairy tale love story.
It's a great story overall, but there's a really special love story, I think. It's real devotion and real loyalty throughout, some really adverse circumstances. Acidice's happiness, I think, would have been quite short-lived. Her whole married life was dominated by war and she rarely saw her husband. I can't really imagine that there would have been much joy for her. He had such a sense of civic duty and she really lost him to that, and I think he did in the end really regret neglecting her. I don't think she would have really seen him much at all. I think certainly I felt like that with filming. I was like, you're never there.
And although he was a great hero, his flaws made him human, I guess.
I am so sorry. The war.
Just thought it was the saddest story, actually, for her.
Be careful.
What?
She married Caimon.
Yeah, but...
Caimon.
Yeah, but that was about it. That's all she had.
And this story is full of other interesting characters.
I played King Darius I. He was the king of Persia at the time that our series starts, and I think he was an admirable character. He was firm, he was fair and forgiving. Although he sat on a high throne, he didn't really look down on his people. In fact, on the contrary, Herodotus tells us that he used to take advice on affairs of state from his wife while in bed. We think of the Romans and the Egyptians as being the great builders of the time, but the Persians were equally their rivals, and they did it without slaves. They regarded truth as a supreme virtue, and they never really got used to the Greeks' attitude to it as more of a commodity that you could manipulate people with. You could argue that one of the great battles was lost because of a Greek lie.
I was elated. It was the actual role I'd hoped to get.
Spartans! Greeks! The order for today!
I just thought of the character Leonidas as a very authoritative person.
Is to kill as many barbarians as we can!
I mean, his courage is legendary, but there's more to him. I'm sure he would have had to been pretty smart. He had everything organised until things went pear-shaped on day 3 of Thermopylae.
Make sure they never forget!
Even though he was outnumbered 100 to 1 on the last day, he still came so close to the most improbable victory in history.
Who we are!
He was unusual for a Spartan because he could inspire other Greeks to a common cause, something that hadn't happened for 600 years. While I was working on Stan's film, I found out that the film was historically correct. Now, if you look at other films made at the time, 300 for example, was not historically correct and had entertaining in mind, whereas Stan's was historically correct and entertains the audience. I like the way the program debunks some myths about the period. For example, day 3 of Thermopylae. I mean, Leonidas had planned to win by day 3, and he was never on a suicide mission.
He was typical of an absolute despot in many ways, quick to blame others. As a result, he caused many of his own armies to desert. He had to be totally in control. He was possibly his own worst enemy, not realising when to give it up, rather than lose face, which in the end could quite well have been his downfall. Yeah, he made an error or two, maybe misjudgments. Nutcase? No, he had a method and a plan, and it was egotistical, certainly. Yes, an arrogant prick, that'd be Xerxes.
The Greco-Persian War is a highly romanticised period of history that continues to spark the interest of people 2,500 years later. The challenge for us today is to use the sources we have, biased and fragmentary as they often are, to delve behind the myths surrounding this period and to get a glimpse of the real story.
One thing we did do after talking to our experts was to go back to the original text from Herodotus, the father of history, written 2,500 years ago. There were some things that just didn't seem to make sense, because with a drama you have to motivate characters, and some of the motivations just didn't seem to be there with the story the way it was presented.
Modern research can throw new lights on many old mysteries. Satellite imagery, reenactments, ballistic tests, and even simple rereadings of 2,500-year-old texts can give us new insights.
Anyone can go to Google Earth and check things in Herodotus that he wrote 2,500 years ago and see if they were true. Two things in particular were very interesting. One cast new light on what happened at the Battle of Marathon, and the other one may go a long way to explaining what really happened to Leonidas and the 300 Spartans on that last day at Thermopylae. We're pretty sure we have solved two of the great myths of the war. Well, as sure as anybody can be 2,500 years later.
Yes, just going to those historic sites, even though I'd been there many times before, gave me the opportunity to pause and to reflect, and to think about how important it was to understand what the people at the time were doing, how they reacted, their courage.
And it actually cast a bit of a new light on some of the things that were in Herodotus.
We should not forget that this was a war, a long war, and wars are won by soldiers. Both Athens and Sparta, and other city-states such as Thebes, were well known for their warriors, and that is because of the way they were trained. Until the late Middle Ages, the fate of nations was decided by what their soldiers did on the battlefield, sometimes within the space of an hour or two. There would have been a totally different legacy from the Persian Wars if the Greeks had not won, and they won because of the way their army, the hoplites, and their sailors fought.
The fate of countries wasn't determined by talk at this time. It was determined by the outcome of battles and wars. And by exploring this in detail, we were able to answer one major question. Were the Greek victories just fabulous propaganda, or could they have really have happened?
Using Mick's knowledge of ancient combat arts really allowed us to implement this area, which is very seldomly seen in film, into this production to make the battle scenes more realistic.
Fighting in those days wasn't about aggression. You had to be cool and calculated or you got killed.
In terms of recreating an ancient battle in the modern world, it's as close as we can get without actually killing each other on camera.
People at the front line were fearless, calculated, and very professional.
They employed tactics that were developed over hundreds of years, and these made huge differences to the outcomes of battles.
And you put the shield on, you put the spear, the helmet, and you got your troops on either side. It's a bit of a power trip. You feel invincible, and you just feel like a Greek god.
There were times when it really hurt. We were fighting in fiberglass armour, and that was hard enough. Imagine what the full weight stuff would have been like. There was no way people would jump around like acrobats like they do in Hollywood with all that gear on.
The real thing would have been torture. Most of the Greek battles were fought during 35-degree heat, 21 kilos of equipment, and could last as long as a whole day.
If I was back in them days, I would much rather have been at the back of the line instead of at the front, because those guys in them days at the front would have died. And as much as I have the respect for that, I'd rather be alive.
I understand now why the Greeks fought shoulder to shoulder. You needed your enemy to be in one place, right in front of you with all that gear on. You could see the advantage that the Greek phalanx had over the Persians. Even in the simulation, the guys playing the Persians were obviously intimidated by the size of our spears.
I'm overwhelmed with it. It looks really good.
Yeah, and what I've seen of it, it's mind-blowing. For the first time, the most realistic ancient fight scenes ever captured on film.
Democracy. Such a nice concept, but it actually started out of a feud between two tyrants. One of its first acts was to start a pretty unjustifiable war, and then it became super aggressive and dominant, and eventually led to its own self-destruction. Greece was a poor country, but the power given to a lot of poor people seemed to go to their heads. Somebody said greed is good. It was good initially for the Athenian democracy, but greed ended up killing the Athenian democracy. Nowadays, we see the same thing. People still voting with their hip pockets. They vote for governments that promise them things that are really not sustainable, and eventually the chickens come home to roost. A famous movie maker said 80 years ago that a documentary was a creative interpretation of actuality.
There's that old adage that there's only really 12 stories out there. You see in it the building blocks of every story that's come afterwards. This is where it all begins.
You could say it's one of the original stories that everything else in Western culture is based off, I guess.
We wanted to create as much of a feel for the period as we could.
You know, they've really adhered to the historical facts.
This is a fascinating, page-turning type of story. It really grabs you and you want to know what happens next.
I believe we've uncovered some very interesting new pieces of information about what actually happened, and they go a large way to explaining some of the mysteries of the war.
I think it's fantastic, it's entertaining, but it's also really educational. It would be a fantastic educational tool.
We didn't want to travellogue of ruins and artefacts. We wanted a real story, and therefore we tried to retain as much of the drama of the real story as possible. Kaimo's own story was the sort of stuff that you would spend years scripting. It was really very interesting.
Definitely feel proud to have been a part of it.
It's a great bit of history that you shouldn't miss.
It's very entertaining, but it's not just entertainment, it's a great insight into the life and times of ancient Greece.
The legacy of ancient Greece resounds around us all today, which is something I always find surprising when you compare its weight, influence and reputation to the realities of ancient Greek society. Its continual internal conflict, for example, punctuated by only brief periods of peace and unity like after the Persian Wars or under Alexander the Great, and its relatively small size when you compare it to the other great civilizations of our past, like Persia. So few gave us so much. Quite frankly, it's astonishing. But to do that, they had to win this war first. Welcome to the First War for the West, a time when history quite literally became legend. Enjoy.